Sorry. This table's for family only. For a second, I thought I misheard him. Lucas was standing between me and the long banquet table, one hand resting casually on the chair backs, the other lifting just enough to point past me, toward the black trash can near the service station. He smirked, slow and satisfied, like this was a joke he'd rehearsed. You can wait over there, he added, voice calm, confident. We're about to sit. The words landed harder than shouting would have. Around us, the restaurant kept moving, servers carrying plates, glasses clinking, soft music playing under the low hum of conversation, but the space between us went still. I felt eyes turn. Not all at once. One by one. Curious glances. Awkward pauses. The kind of silence that tells you everyone understands something ugly just happened, and no one plans to stop it. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't remind him who I was. I just stood there, purse looped over my wrist, taking in the scene like an outsider. The white tablecloths. The polished wood floors. The extended family already seated, carefully avoiding my eyes. No shock on their faces. No confusion. Just a quiet, practiced stillness. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't new behavior. It was just the first time he'd done it out loud. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm Lucas's older sister. And before you wonder what kind of argument leads to something like this, let me say this clearly. I wasn't late, I wasn't drunk, and I hadn't caused a scene. I showed up the way I always do, composed, prepared, expecting basic decency from my own family. Lucas's smile widened when I didn't react. He liked control that didn't require force. He always had. Moments like this fed something in him, especially when there was an audience and he knew I wouldn't explode. He counted on that. If you're watching this right now, take a second and notice where you are. What time is it for you? Morning coffee? Late night scrolling? Wherever you're watching from, just know this moment happened in real time, in a real place, with real people who chose silence over intervention. I nodded once, small, polite, and stepped back. Not toward the trash can. Not toward the table. But toward the exit. As I walked away, I felt something settle in my chest, quiet and heavy. I didn't say a word. But I stopped seeing my brother the same way. People like to think these moments come out of nowhere. That one day, a brother suddenly turns cruel. But they don't. They start quietly. They start early. When we were kids, Lucas could break a window, lie about it, and still get dessert. If I came home a few minutes past curfew, the whole house went silent, the kind of silence that meant disappointment, not danger. My mother would sigh, my father would shake his head, and Lucas would stand behind them, smirking, safe in his role as the good one. He wasn't smarter. He wasn't kinder. He just knew how to look harmless when it mattered. That was enough. Every family has its lines, the ones drawn so long ago, nobody remembers who picked up the pen. Ours were carved between responsible and deserving. I was the responsible one. He was the one who deserved help. That's how my parents put it, over and over, year after year. When college came, Lucas needed support. When I graduated early, I was told, you're independent, you'll be fine. When I got my first job and paid my own rent, my parents said they were proud. But the pride felt like distance, not warmth. Every milestone I reached alone became proof that I didn't need them. Every mistake Lucas made became proof that he did. That's how favoritism works. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It calls neglect trust and dependence love. And you don't realize how deep it runs until you're standing in a restaurant 30 years later, being told you don't belong at your own family's table. Looking back now, I can trace the thread. The ignored birthdays. The mismatched gifts. The quiet corrections when I called out unfairness. Evelyn, don't start drama. They thought my silence meant peace. It didn't. It meant conditioning. I learned early that defending myself meant losing them faster. And so, when I stood there that night, humiliated in front of everyone, I wasn't shocked. I was remembering. Every you'll be fine. Every let him feel included. Every you don't need help. They had been training me for that moment all along. I didn't know it yet, but that pattern, that lifelong exclusion, was about to become my greatest weapon. What people never understand is why certain moments stay. Why they don't fade the way others do. Why one sentence, spoken once, can outweigh years of tolerance. This was one of those moments. It wasn't louder than anything before. It wasn't cruel in a dramatic way. It was calm, casual, and said without hesitation. That's why it cut deeper. Private disrespect happens behind doors. It gives you space to reinterpret it, to downplay it, to tell yourself you misunderstood. You can survive it because no one else has to see it. Public disrespect is different. It doesn't ask for permission. It announces itself and lets strangers decide who you are before you ever speak. That night, I wasn't humiliated in isolation. I was reframed in front of people who had no history with me. They didn't know my work, my sacrifices, or my role in that family. All they knew was what they witnessed. And what they witnessed was silence being mistaken for insignificance. When he spoke, he didn't just dismiss me. He positioned me. He placed me outside the circle and let the room absorb it as fact. No one challenged it. No one corrected him. The absence of resistance made it official. I felt myself disappear in real time. Not physically, but socially. I became something smaller without consenting to it. And because I didn't react, because I didn't defend myself publicly, the moment settled into place like it belonged there. Emotional restraint looks like strength from the outside. Inside, it feels like containment. Every instinct to correct the narrative stayed locked behind composure. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't ask for fairness. I understood that doing so would only confirm the role he had assigned me. So I stayed still. I stayed calm. And I absorbed the truth of it. This wasn't about a comment. It was about visibility. It was about being erased where it mattered most. That was the moment I realized something irreversible had shifted. Nothing had exploded. Nothing needed repair. But something had ended quietly, right there, in front of witnesses who would never know what they'd seen. People later asked me why I didn't say anything. They assumed silence meant shock, or fear, or weakness. The truth was simpler and harder to explain. I stayed quiet because I understood what that moment was built on. Public humiliation feeds on reaction. It survives on raised voices, visible hurt, or desperate correction. Without that, it has nothing to anchor itself to. When someone humiliates you publicly, they're not just speaking to you. They're performing for the room. They're waiting for confirmation that they've landed the blow. A gasp. A protest. An argument. Something they can point to and say, "See, I matter enough to shake her." I refuse to give him that. Silence, when chosen deliberately, changes the shape of the moment. It doesn't erase what happened, but it removes the payoff. Instead of becoming a scene, it becomes an observation. Instead of escalating, it stalls. The attention shifts. People grow uncomfortable. They don't know where to look. The power stops circulating. I stood there and let the quiet stretch longer than was polite. Long enough for the discomfort to belong to everyone, not just me. Long enough for his smirk to lose direction. I didn't defend myself because I didn't need to. The people who mattered would remember exactly how calm I stayed. The people who didn't would have revealed themselves. What I understood, even then, was that confrontation would have served him. Silence served me. It allowed me to see the situation clearly, without adrenaline or embarrassment distorting it. It gave me space to think instead of react. There's a misconception that strength always announces itself. Sometimes it withdraws. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes it records everything quietly and waits. That night, my silence wasn't submission. It was data collection. I wasn't deciding how to respond to him. I was deciding what I would never accept again. And that decision didn't require words, explanations, or witnesses. It only required clarity. When I finally turned away, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't noticeable. But it was final. The silence had already done its work. It started small, almost invisible, a whisper of entitlement creeping into every family gathering. My younger brother had a way of acting as if every achievement, every gift, every moment belonged to him by default. He didn't announce it loudly, he didn't have to, but his presence carried a weight that made everyone else shift. Chairs slid aside, eyes darted to him, conversations bent around his agenda. I had spent decades contributing quietly, planning holidays, handling logistics, paying my share of bills, supporting family events, but somehow, in his narrative, none of that existed. Money was one of his subtle weapons. Whenever an expense arose, his voice was always first. "We should do it this way," he'd say, already assuming someone else would pay the cost he described. And people did, because they were afraid of his temper, afraid of conflict, or simply conditioned to let him lead. He didn't need to threaten. Authority in our family had been given to him by default, and he wielded it like an invisible club. Status followed the money. Any social event, any small gathering, became his stage. From birthday parties to simple dinners, the subtle gestures told a story. He was central, he deserved attention, he had ownership over the experience. And as the crowd smiled at his jokes or praised his opinions, my contributions disappeared into the background, unnoticed, taken for granted. Control extended beyond money and attention. He had mastered the art of reshaping reality so that he appeared generous, responsible, even reasonable. If I suggested a plan or voiced concern, it was reframed as a critique, a challenge, or, at best, a good try. My input was ignored unless it could be twisted to enhance his image. Over time, I learned the dangerous truth. The more quietly I worked, the more power he assumed. And the louder he acted, the more people believed him. There were moments I almost spoke up, felt the rise of indignation in my chest, but I had learned something crucial from years of observation. He thrived on reaction. Any outward expression of frustration, anger, or embarrassment became fuel for his sense of entitlement. My contributions, financial, emotional, organizational, were real and tangible, yet they didn't count unless I let him confront me with them. Even now, reflecting back, I saw the patterns clearly. Every dinner, every conversation, every decision had been quietly catalogued and subtly skewed to his favor. I had built, I had prepared, I had contributed. But in the public eye, and often in the private one, he owned the story. And the most insidious part was that no one called him out. My parents rarely intervened, nodding politely, echoing platitudes that reinforced his dominance, his taking care of things. "You're independent, you'll manage." By the time I realized the full extent of his entitlement, it was already a social fact. He had positioned himself as the inheritor of everything without needing to earn it. And in that quiet, calculated space, I made a decision. I would no longer let him dictate what counted. I would no longer allow his quiet, confident assumption of ownership to erase my presence, my labor, or my worth. The game had been defined by him for decades, but now, I was ready to observe, to catalogue, and eventually, to act. And yet, I didn't confront him immediately. I didn't need to. Entitlement, after all, reveals itself in its own time, and the longer I stayed quiet, the more obvious his patterns became to everyone around him. It was only a matter of time before the truth, our reality, began to outweigh the story he had told so convincingly for years. It was late evening when I found myself alone in the kitchen, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Patrick had gone to check on Archer, who was finishing her homework, and I finally allowed myself to exhale. I sat at the counter, staring at the half-empty coffee cup, and the reality settled in with the weight of cold metal. Years of subtle erasure, of quiet dismissal, of being pushed aside by my own family, all came together in a single, undeniable truth. I was done allowing it. I thought about the restaurant incident again, not with rage, not with shock, but with a clarity that comes only after enough repeated patterns. Drew's smirk, the way he had gestured toward the trash can, the utter silence of the room except for the low murmurs of the other guests, it had all been a message I could no longer ignore. And it wasn't just that moment, it was a lifetime of small cuts, carefully applied, designed to undermine me, to make me feel independent enough to handle it while he claimed ownership of attention, resources, and respect. For decades, I had tolerated it. I had smiled, nodded, and quietly complied while he assumed privilege and my parents silently approved. I had justified it in my own mind with rationalizations. Maybe it's easier this way, maybe he needs encouragement, maybe confrontation only brings chaos. But now, as I sat alone, I realized those excuses had built the cage I had lived in, and it was mine to unlock. I made a mental note, no grand declaration, no dramatic confrontation, no public speech. This was not about proving a point in front of Drew, or even my parents. This was about reclaiming the narrative of my own life. I refused to tolerate disrespect, erasure, or entitlement directed at me or my family. The line was clear, drawn internally but etched as firmly as steel. I would no longer comply, I would no longer give without intention, I would no longer allow anyone to define my worth. The quiet tension in the kitchen mirrored the tension I had carried for years. Each breath reminded me of the countless moments I had swallowed irritation, anger, and disappointment, only to smile when it was expected. That restraint had been a survival mechanism, but now it transformed into strategy. Silence, once a shield to avoid conflict, would become a tool of clarity and observation. I would let Drew's actions speak for themselves, and the world would see the pattern he had created. I thought about Archer too, watching her from the doorway as she carefully colored within the lines of her assignment. She noticed everything, internalized everything, and her understanding of fairness and respect was still forming. The realization struck me fully: if I continued to submit to this subtle domination, I would be teaching her the wrong lesson about value, power, and self-respect. My choice was not about revenge. It was about modeling resilience and intentional boundaries. I allowed myself a quiet smile, the kind that comes from calm decision-making rather than fleeting satisfaction. I didn't need acknowledgement, and I didn't seek applause. I only needed the truth in my own mind, a firm understanding that my patience had limits, and that those limits were being respected from that moment onward. That night, I began to catalogue the patterns I had seen, noting each instance, each assumption Drew had made about entitlement, each silent complicity from our parents. Every detail mattered, because the future I intended would rely on careful observation, deliberate choices, and the power of quiet, unassailable control. For the first time in years, I felt not just anger or frustration, but readiness. And in that quiet readiness, I understood that real change didn't need a shout, it only needed conviction. The first subtle tremor came the morning after I quietly redirected our family accounts. Drew arrived at my home, grinning as if he owned the place, expecting the usual compliance, the easy access to support he had taken for granted for years. He opened his mouth to demand, to assert, to remind me of his perceived dominance, but quickly faltered when he noticed something different in my posture, my expression. I didn't give him a word, didn't raise my voice, didn't even roll my eyes. I simply began attending to Archer's breakfast, moving with calm efficiency, and the air shifted. He attempted to log into the shared credit account, his fingers hesitating on the keys. I watched from the doorway, quiet but precise, as confusion flickered across his face. "Weird," he muttered under his breath. "That shouldn't be, what did you?" His sentence trailed off as he realized the access he assumed as his birthright had quietly disappeared. There were no alarms, no confrontation, just the stark absence of the privileges he had relied on. Every small assumption he had made about his control was quietly evaporating. I could see the irritation mounting, subtle at first, clenched jaw, tapping fingers, the repeated glances toward me, as if he could conjure authority through mere proximity. He tried to ask questions that would normally receive immediate compliance or guidance, but I kept my attention fixed on Archer, calmly pouring juice and reminding her to finish homework. I didn't need to answer. The situation itself was delivering the lesson. The confusion turned to frustration within hours. Drew tried the usual channels, messages, phone calls, even a passive-aggressive text to Patrick, hoping to invoke compliance through assumed alliances, but every attempt met silence or redirection. I had made no grand announcements, no accusations, no dramatic declarations. I had only acted decisively, and the natural consequences of his entitlement began to take shape. His influence, his assumed control, his access to unearned support, all of it quietly disappeared like sand through fingers he didn't realize were empty. I watched him pacing the living room later that day, muttering about oversight, about errors, about Patrick and me being difficult. His irritation was palpable, but there was nothing he could do. He realized, in the only way he could, that authority isn't granted by loud demands or family approval. It is recognized when boundaries are enforced consistently, without theatrics. The shift extended beyond mere finances. Invitations, privileges, casual allowances he had taken as routine, suddenly recalibrated. He would no longer assume a seat at Archer's milestones, no longer expect unquestioned support in social or professional contexts, no longer treat our home as an extension of his entitlement. Even Felicia began to notice the change, casting him anxious glances, unsure how to proceed now that his influence was quietly nullified. I stayed calm, as always. My actions spoke louder than any words I might have used. Each step he took, each frustrated attempt to regain what was never his by right, only reinforced the clarity of my decision. Archer noticed too, her eyes wide as she watched the shift, learning without a lecture how consequences manifest when boundaries are respected. By nightfall, Drew had retreated to his own apartment, seething silently, aware that the rules had changed but unable to articulate exactly how. He didn't understand yet that it wasn't me being punitive, it was simply the natural result of decades of unchecked entitlement finally meeting deliberate resistance. And in that quiet, deliberate withholding, I found the first taste of control, subtle but undeniable, setting the stage for the inevitable realization that his assumptions no longer dictated our reality. It began subtly, the way cracks appear in what seems like solid stone. Drew showed up at the annual family gathering, expecting his usual deference, the smiles, the nods, the unquestioned attention he had always assumed were his by default. But as he tried to command the room, the usual acquiescence was absent. Cousins exchanged quick glances, aunts hesitated before offering the obligatory compliments he counted on, and even his friends seemed a step removed, unsure how to engage with the confidence he had always projected. I stayed in the corner, quietly observing, Archer sitting at my side, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress, noticing the tension but trusting me to navigate the room. Drew's smile faltered once, twice, as he tried to regain his footing. He made a pointed remark about family traditions, expecting laughter, but only polite nods met him. He raised his voice slightly, the tone sharp, and some relatives shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that the harmony he relied on was no longer automatic. His usual social cues, honed over years of familial favoritism, failed to elicit the expected response. And yet, I didn't intervene, didn't whisper a correction, didn't offer a rescue. My calm presence was enough. The contrast between his scrambling and my composed demeanor spoke louder than any words I could have offered. Later, when he attempted to recount the evening to his circle of friends, his narrative began to fracture. Small inconsistencies emerged, a cousin's pointed question, a gentle correction from an uncle, a sister-in-law's subtle facial expression. Drew tried to assert dominance, weaving exaggeration into his story to maintain credibility, but each effort only highlighted the gaps between expectation and reality. Community perception, built painstakingly over years, was beginning to tilt, imperceptibly at first but inevitably. Even within the family group chat, messages that previously reflected uncritical support began to shift. Shorter responses, careful phrasing, questions about his plans, these were the silent signals of recalibrated respect. I read them quietly, noting the pattern, my lips pressed together as the ripple of consequences expanded outward. The damage was entirely organic. I did not need to comment, to gloat, or to draw attention to the change. It was happening because entitlement and assumptions had collided with consistency and quiet resolve. Drew noticed too, though he could not articulate why. He felt the subtle tension in his interactions, the hesitation in greetings, the polite restraint in compliments. He tried to force his usual charisma, the practiced gestures and rehearsed lines, but each attempt seemed increasingly hollow. The room, the messages, the glances, all reflected a truth he had never been willing to acknowledge. Authority and respect are not inherited, they are recognized. By the end of the evening, his aura of unchallenged entitlement had noticeably diminished. Even his most loyal supporters exchanged tentative looks, as if testing the water before fully re-engaging. Archer leaned against me, whispering a question about why Drew seemed so frustrated, and I simply shook my head, allowing her to witness the natural consequences of unchecked behavior being met with unwavering composure. Through the quiet observation, I realized the subtle power shift was undeniable. Drew's public image, carefully curated over decades, was beginning to crack under its own weight, and I had not uttered a single word to hasten it. The lesson, invisible yet potent, was unfolding in real time. Control cannot be demanded. It can only be quietly acknowledged when boundaries are enforced with patience and restraint. The night ended with Drew retreating earlier than usual, his forced smile replaced by a tense line of his jaw. Even his exit carried the weight of an unspoken realization that the effortless influence he once wielded was no longer guaranteed. And in the calm aftermath, I felt a measure of quiet satisfaction, knowing the first cracks in the facade were just the beginning, the prelude to the deeper changes still to come. It didn't take long for Drew to realize the quiet shift had tangible consequences. A week after the gathering, he cornered me in the parking lot of my school, his face tight with frustration, hands clenched as if he could physically force the respect he had always assumed. The late afternoon sunlight glinted off his watch, the one he had insisted I admire when he first got it, as though material displays could substitute for earned credibility. "Regina," he began, voice low and controlled, though the tension beneath it threatened to break through, "we need to talk about everything." "Why are you suddenly?" he faltered, the sentence hanging in the air like a half-finished accusation. I kept my hands folded at my side, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady on his, and let him carry the weight of his own words. I had learned that confrontation loses its power when met with calm. Each attempt he made to provoke an emotional response, each subtle jab at my choices, my independence, my history of quiet support, met only a measured gaze and a soft, unyielding silence. I didn't interrupt, I didn't justify. The shift in energy, the one he had not anticipated, was already doing its work. Drew's frustration grew visible. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near hiss, attempting the intimidation he had perfected over years of family dominance. "You think you can just change things without me noticing?" His words were sharp, meant to pierce, but my stillness absorbed the tension. Archer, had she been present, might have understood in an instant. This was not a shouting match, but a demonstration of control through composure. Power, I realized, was more persuasive when it was silent and consistent. He flailed for examples, citing obligations I had quietly taken on for the family, money lent, favors performed, assuming that visibility equaled leverage. I did not respond. Not because I lacked answers, but because my calm now held authority on its own. Each accusation that left his mouth only reinforced what I had been building. Respect does not arise from volume or intimidation, but from consistency, reliability, and boundaries enforced without spectacle. As the conversation stretched, Drew's demeanor subtly shifted. His anger edged toward confusion, his certainty faltering. He had spent decades expecting compliance, and in that expectation he had built a fortress around himself. Yet here, in the quiet confrontation, the foundation showed cracks. Without my even raising my voice, the dynamic had flipped. He no longer held the social or emotional leverage he once assumed was his by right. I let him speak until the words ran thin, letting silence carry the weight that arguments could not. He took a few steps back, hands dropping slightly, and for a moment his expression was one of recognition. He could not command compliance simply through insistence or familial expectation. This was not humiliation, nor victory. It was the natural acknowledgement of a shift he could neither immediately accept nor fully articulate. Walking away from the encounter, I felt the gravity of subtle power. Drew's confrontation, meant to intimidate, had only revealed the invisible lines I had drawn. My calm, my methodical approach to boundaries, had changed the playing field. And though he would continue to test it in moments to come, the reality was clear. Influence built on entitlement cannot withstand measured, unshakeable restraint. By the time I reached my car, the tension in my chest had eased. The confrontation had not escalated into drama or spectacle, yet the message was unmistakable. Drew had been met with an authority he could neither buy nor bully, a quiet correction of the imbalance that had persisted for years. And as I drove away, I knew the subtle but irreversible shift had begun, one that would reshape not just interactions, but the expectations and respect within our family for good. Weeks passed, but the echo of that quiet confrontation lingered in ways I hadn't anticipated. Life, as always, continued with its familiar rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch, Archer practicing her violin, grading papers at the kitchen table while Patrick moved through the house with effortless calm. Yet underneath the routine, the energy of change hummed quietly. Drew's absence from our interactions, subtle but unmistakable, was a new normal. He would call occasionally, messages tinged with veiled demands or thinly veiled threats, but I no longer felt compelled to respond immediately, or at all. Silence had become a tool of its own, a demonstration that authority need not be loud to be absolute. In the evenings, I found myself reflecting on what had truly shifted. It wasn't about winning arguments or demonstrating superiority. It was about presence and consistency, about dignity held firm even when others attempted to diminish it. I realized that dominance, the kind built on intimidation and expectation, fades when the audience changes. Drew's displays of entitlement relied on an audience that responded to noise, to spectacle, to his assumed authority. Remove that audience, step outside the dynamic that empowers him, and suddenly the power erodes on its own. I thought about Archer, watching her small hands navigate the keys of her violin, and understood the lasting lesson: dignity and composure outlast rage and dominance. While he may have expected immediate recognition, his actions now held little sway over the atmosphere of our home, or over the way Archer perceived what was acceptable in relationships. I had learned, quietly, that protecting one's peace sometimes required no confrontation at all, only patience, consistency, and the refusal to grant validation to undeserved behavior. I reflected on the weeks leading up to this calm. Each subtle boundary I had set, declining small financial requests, refusing to validate manipulation, simply stepping away from family chaos, had accumulated like invisible armor. Drew had tested each one, nudging at the edges, but never forcefully enough to break through. And in that accumulation, the shift became inevitable. The imbalance that had favored him for decades was slowly, irreversibly, correcting itself. The quiet nature of this victory was perhaps the most powerful realization. There had been no shouting, no dramatic declarations, no moments meant to humiliate. Just measured, consistent behavior that communicated limits more clearly than words ever could. In this environment, I noticed a subtle change in our mutual acquaintances and distant family members. Respect no longer required approval from him. My choices, my restraint, had reshaped perception without theatrics, and in that space, real authority had taken root. Walking through the kitchen one evening, listening to Archer hum softly to herself, I felt a weight lift. Control, I understood, was not about seizing the moment but about sustaining composure through the long arc of interaction. Drew's frustration had become an echo fading into the background of life, a reminder that respect earned quietly is more enduring than dominance asserted loudly. The lessons of patience, consistency, and dignity had revealed themselves not in a single confrontation, but across weeks of steadfast behavior. Even Patrick noticed the subtle shift, his eyes meeting mine in a silent acknowledgement of what had transpired. There was no need to recount the details, no urge to boast. The respect that had once eluded me now settled naturally into place, not because I demanded it, but because it was quietly claimed through action and composure. I understood finally that protecting one's own integrity and peace requires the long view, a calm endurance that reshapes relationships over time, leaving the disruptive and entitled scrambling to catch up. In these weeks of reflection, I realized how fragile dominance is when it relies solely on spectacle and expectation. Authority built on noise collapses when met with patience and unwavering self-possession. And while Drew may continue to test boundaries, the pattern was clear: dignity and quiet consistency have a permanence that momentary outbursts cannot touch. I didn't need to lecture, argue, or prove anything. The shift had happened in the quiet, and that quiet was enough. I looked at Archer, practicing with precision, and felt the weight of what I had learned sink in fully. This wasn't about vengeance or punishment, it was about demonstrating a standard of behavior and integrity that outlasted the chaos of entitlement. The lessons, lived and modeled, were more enduring than any confrontation. And in that realization, I felt a deep sense of calm authority settle over our household, one that would shape our family dynamics for years to come. As the evening sun cast a warm glow across the room, illuminating the small, steady rhythm of life continuing around me, I understood that my quiet reflection had revealed something profound. Control is transient when unearned, but dignity is permanent when consistently held. And in that permanence, I found not triumph over my brother, but the far more lasting victory of peace, stability, and unshakable self-respect. The days after Drew's subtle retreat felt almost surreal. There was no grand announcement, no confrontation to declare victory. The absence itself spoke volumes. He had tested every limit I had quietly set over the past months, and now the space between us was measured and firm. I no longer monitored his movements or waited for the next attempt to provoke. The energy had shifted, and I could finally breathe in a rhythm that belonged solely to my household. Archer's laughter returned to the kitchen, light and unhurried, a stark contrast to the tense silence that had followed the restaurant incident. Even small routines, homework at the table, Patrick making coffee, Archer humming while drawing, felt infused with a sense of calm I hadn't realized I had been missing. I noticed how easily our life flowed without the undercurrent of expectation. Invitations, favors, unsolicited opinions. Drew's presence no longer dictated how I arranged my day or allocated attention. The walls of our home carried only the sound of chosen interactions, the warmth of family I valued and the silence of boundaries he could no longer cross. Messages went unanswered, calls declined with effortless detachment, social media connections quietly severed. Nothing needed explanation. Silence was sufficient, and in that sufficiency, the quiet authority I had cultivated became visible even to outsiders. Occasionally, I glimpsed Drew through shared contacts or mutual events. He looked unsettled, aware of the shift he could neither articulate nor control. That unease, carried without dramatic confrontations, quietly underscored the balance that had changed. Patrick would glance at me sometimes, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement in his eyes. The balance of power in this house had been rewritten, not by shouting or threats, but by consistency, calm, and refusal to validate behavior that had never deserved it. Archer thrived in the new rhythm. She spoke freely, moved without fear of being erased or mocked, and began to understand her own agency in subtle, observable ways. She mirrored the quiet confidence I had learned to nurture in myself. I saw her carrying out her small choices, from what to wear to how she managed her chores, with a sense of self that had been suppressed for too long under family dynamics weighted toward entitlement. And in those moments, I felt the most profound acknowledgement of the shift. My influence now modeled stability, calm, and self-possession rather than submission or reaction. There were days when Drew attempted to test the waters again, an offhand remark, a pointed question, but I met each with the same measured composure I had honed over years. No lectures, no forced forgiveness, no dramatic display of authority. My response was the continuation of our daily life, unshaken, uninterrupted, quietly absolute. Each time, his expectations faltered, and the weight of his previous assumptions diminished. The spaces between us became the most definitive statements of control I could have ever made. The final moments of closure were not punctuated by confrontation but by routine. Grocery runs, school drop-offs, quiet evenings on the porch, each normal act reinforced the truth that my household, my decisions, and my daughter's sense of safety were mine to steward. Drew's shadow lingered only in memory, and that shadow was no longer able to distort the light we had created. I could step into each day with confidence that no entitlement could erode, and no expectation could override. I reflected on what had changed. It wasn't revenge, nor was it dramatic exposure or retribution. It was ownership, of my choices, my home, my daughter's environment, and my own sense of self. Each small act of boundary setting, each refusal to participate in manipulative patterns, had accumulated into something undeniable. The quietness was my ally, and through it, the peace I had long sought arrived unannounced but absolute. Looking at Archer, I saw both the resilience I had nurtured and the freedom she now carried. My calm, steady presence had replaced the tension that had ruled our lives. And in that steady presence, I understood fully that protecting self-worth often meant embracing silence over spectacle, consistency over confrontation. The final truth settled quietly: some battles aren't won with anger, and some victories are realized not in noise, but in the unshakable space of chosen boundaries and unwavering self-respect. I closed the door on that chapter without ceremony. There was no celebration, no lingering resentment, no words left unsaid that demanded response. The house hummed with ordinary life, ordinary care, and the extraordinary stability of a boundary firmly held. Drew Castro no longer dictated the energy of our home, and in that absence, I finally grasped the rare power of quiet resolution. The calm I carried was not fragile, it was deliberate enough to transform a lifetime of imbalance into a space where Archer and I could exist fully, freely, and on terms I alone had chosen. And as I watched Archer tuck her sketchbook away, ready for another evening of music and homework, I felt the last trace of tension dissolve. The ownership of our lives, our dignity, and our peace had been quietly, irrevocably claimed. I did not need to speak it aloud. The calmness of our home, the rhythm of our ordinary life, and the clarity of my own self-worth said it all. The boundaries were mine, the space was mine, and in that quiet certainty, I understood the deepest truth of all. Some victories are silent, and yet, they resonate louder than any argument ever could.